Okay, so I want to take a bit of time in these first few lectures to talk about arguments, specifically moral arguments, but before we do that, I want to say something about arguments generally. Um, and now philosophy is mostly about arguments. I mean, what are good arguments? What are bad arguments? How to make an argument for your position. So, before we can do moral philosophy, I think this stuff is really foundational. So we need to talk a bit about it, and I will admit to you guys this might be a little bit dry. But, it's one of those things, if we don't talk about it, I don't think we're going to be able to do a very good job engaging with the material that is more interesting. So, even if it might not be the most fun thing, you have to lay a foundation, right? I remember I took Taekwondo when I was a kid, and I thought, oh great, we're going to break boards, we're going to kick over our heads. And what do we do when we start with? We did a lot of stretches, we did a lot of exercise, right? Well, we did that because the point being, if you try to do that stuff, put your fist through a board or throw a kick over your head and you haven't stretched enough and you aren't in shape, you're just going to hurt yourself, right? You're not going to be able to do it. So, in the same way, this stuff about arguments is kind of getting us in shape to talk about the other course material. Now, look, I think it's important to talk about what we mean by argument in a philosophy class, right? One of the things Vaughan talks about, and it's true, is that words often have a lot of different meanings. And it's fine. You can use argument in other ways outside of philosophy, outside of this class, but we use it to mean a very specific thing. We don't mean a sort of verbal dispute, right? You might think of that couple in the restaurant everyone's trying not to look at. You might think of two idiots on cable news, like insulting each other, so on and so forth, right? Might even think of two idiots on primetime yelling at each other who are running for president, right? The presidential debates are supposed to be arguments. They turn into verbal sparring matches a lot of times. That is not what we mean. When we talk about arguments, we mean something different. An argument is a statement or series of statements. The premise or premises, usually you'll have more than one premise, that provide rational support for another statement, the conclusion. Series of statements that are supposed to give some sort of support, some reason for thinking that this other statement, the conclusion, is true. So here is a very basic argument. In many flu seasons, over 30,000 Americans will die of the flu, and even in a mild flu season, more than 10,000 people die. So we should take the flu much more seriously than we do, right? What's our conclusion here? Well, it's the last statement. So we should take the flu much more seriously than we often do. What are our premises? Premises, let's literally just one. I guess you could break it into two sentences, right? But most flu seasons, 30,000 people die. Even in a mild one, 10,000 people die. So we should take the flu more seriously than we do. We'll talk more about this. Usually in its good form, it's good writing to indicate your conclusion with sort of these indicator words. So, therefore, because. Vaughan gives a list of them. I might give you guys a cheat sheet of these. People won't always do this, though, so just be aware of that. So here's another argument. If you take the time to learn a foreign language, it should be one that is likely to be useful. Latin is not useful since no one actually speaks it anymore, but Spanish is very useful since lots of people speak it in the US. Therefore, if you have the choice between learning Spanish or Latin, you should learn Spanish. I don't know. Maybe you don't have to agree with this. You don't have to think it's right. Maybe you love Latin and think it's great. The point is, we're giving you reasons to think that Latin is a better foreign language to learn than Spanish, if you have to choose between the two, right? Might not be convinced by those reasons, you might be convinced, but, you know, we are giving reasons for this conclusion. If you have the choice between Latin and Spanish, take Spanish, right? Two very basic arguments. So, we often make arguments as a way of trying to persuade others. You know, Vaughan, I think, just kind of point blank says, well, we use arguments to persuade. That's the most common reason, not really the only reason we make arguments, right? We, a lot of times, you know, you might make an argument for a position you don't even necessarily believe yourself, just to see if it is true, right? You know, you don't know, you know, you wonder if you should buy, I don't know, a new phone or something, right? I don't know. And you might make an argument for, you might make an argument against, you know. Maybe you're trying to decide if you believe in God or not, right? If God exists. Maybe you see what kinds of arguments you can make for God's existence. You see what kinds of arguments you can make against, right? Another reason we might make arguments, and this will be one that's pretty common in our course, so I think it's important to talk about, we might make an argument for a position not only that we don't necessarily believe, but one that we think is absolutely false, and we might do that as a way of understanding why other people believe it, right? You know, you might be hardcore pro-life, but it might be a good thing to make an argument for a pro-choice position in abortion just to see why people would believe that, right? Or you might be very, very convinced pro-choice. You might try to see if you can, the best argument you can make for a pro-life position, just to try to understand other people, why they might have their reasons for believing this, right? This is something I'm going to encourage in this class, you know, making arguments for positions you don't believe to try to understand others and why they think what they do, right? You know, I don't want to get on a soapbox here, but I think, you know, it is true that we seem to be especially bad in this country, at least at this time, understanding people who don't agree with us. So, you know, I think making arguments for positions that we don't agree with is a way of understanding people we don't agree with, and I think that's a very good skill to develop, even if you might still think those people are wrong, right? Anyway, climbing off my soapbox and we'll move on. So an argument is, among other things, a means of rational persuasion. Like I said, not the only reason we'll make an argument, but often we make an argument to persuade others. You know, one thing you want to be aware of, especially when people are trying to persuade you of something, is that arguments are not the only means of persuasion. There are other ways of trying to persuade people, non-rational means of persuasion. Probably the biggest one we're going to be concerned with in this class is rhetoric. And a lot of times, when people try to persuade others, they'll throw everything at the wall and hope something sticks, right? So you'll see rhetoric or non-rational persuasion mixed with rational persuasion or argument. In this course, I'm not going to say a whole lot about rhetoric, but you do need to be able to spot it and basically just kind of cut it out, right? We are concerned with argument. We are not concerned with rhetoric. So if you guys want an example of what rhetoric, a non-rational means of persuasion is, let me give you an example. Or rather, let me give you an example from an argument or an article, part of which is argument, a lot of which is rhetoric, that this woman, Anne Applebaum, published in the Atlantic Monthly, a magazine, a few months back, right? So Applebaum is trying to argue that there is a new trend of censorship or punishing people for exercising their right to free speech, right? Maybe she's right, maybe she's wrong, I don't know. But Applebaum's article, a lot of it is rhetoric, right? She calls the article the New Puritans. And so here's an excerpt of Applebaum's article. We read Hawthorne's The Scarlet Letter with a certain self-satisfaction, such an old-fashioned tale. Even Hawthorne sneered at the Puritans with their sad-colored garments and gray-crowned hats, their strict conformism, their narrow minds and hypocrisy. And today we are not just hip and modern, we live in a land governed by the rule of law. We have procedures designed to prevent the meting out of unfair punishment. Scarlet letters are a thing of the past. Except, of course, they aren't. Right here in America, right now, it is possible to meet people who have lost everything, jobs, money, friends, colleagues, after violating no laws and no workplace rules either. Instead, they have broken, or accused of having broken, social codes having to do with race, sex, personal behavior, or even acceptable humor, which may not have existed 5 years ago, or maybe 5 months ago. Some have made egregious errors in judgment. Some have done nothing at all. It is not always easy to tell. Now look. Think about what she's saying here, right? Of what she says, what gives you reason? Or if it were true, assuming that the statements were true, which statements would give you reason to think there is this worrying trend of censorship or punishing people for expressing their opinions? Think about it for a second, right? Well, look, I picked this block from her article because it's not super hard here, right? Think about this first paragraph. This could all be true, right? You know, every statement she makes here could be true, and it could also be the case that there's no real trend of censorship in the US right now, right? You know, she thinks we don't like the Puritans. I actually think the Puritans get a bad rap. I mean, they weren't perfect, but, you know, I think we treat them pretty unfairly, but that's neither here nor there, right? She thinks we don't like the Puritans. Oh, the Puritans were hypocrites. They dressed really badly. They were sad looking. You know, we think of bad things when we think of the Puritans, and she wants to play on this association, right? She wants you to feel bad things when you think about, you know, this topic of censorship. This isn't giving us any reasons. This is playing on our emotions. This is playing on certain preconceptions we have about the Puritans. Doesn't give us any reason to think there really is a worrying trend of censorship. This second paragraph, it might not be true. It might be true. I don't know. If it were true, if people did lose their jobs for expressing their opinions, if people did lose their friends for breaking some code of social behavior, well, you know, that would give us reason to think that there's a trend of censorship. If people lost a lot of money for doing these things, that would give us reason to think there's some trend of censorship. Again, I don't know if these things are true. I don't know if there really is such a trend of censorship. I'll be honest with you, I'm a little bit skeptical that it's as bad as she makes it out, if there is a trend. But at least these things give us reasons to think it's true, right? Unlike this stuff in red, these are reasons this stuff in red just plays on bad associations. It doesn't give us any actual reason to think her claims are true. She does this a lot through the article. If you guys read it, she compares the people she doesn't like to communists. She talks about Stalin. You know, again, most of us don't like communists. Unlike the Puritans, I don't think the communists get a bad rap. I certainly don't think Stalin gets a bad rap. But again, she's just playing on this fact. We think of Stalin, we think of communists, we think, oh, ooh, bad, right? Again, not giving us reasons to think her claims are true. The reason this is important, well, there's two reasons. One, don't be taken in by rhetoric or other non-rational attempts at persuasion, right? Rhetoric is common in writing. You'll see other non-rational attempts at persuasion in, say, commercials, happy, sunny things with the product, happy, fun people using the product, whether it's deodorant or beer or whatever. You're supposed to associate the product with happy, fun times, right? Or if you watch a political ad, maybe it's an attack ad. If it's an attack ad, they'll filter their opponent through really cold blue filters. Then they'll slow them down so they look really ominous, and they'll play minor key music, right? It doesn't give you any reason to think that somebody's political opponent is a bad person to vote for. It's just playing on your emotions, your associations, right? Non-rational persuasion. So it's good to spot that stuff, because I do think non-rational persuasion is an attempt to manipulate us, and it's good to spot it and not be taken in by it. But for purposes of this class, for purposes of your grade, which might be the thing you're more worried about at the moment, you need to spot rhetoric, because when you're evaluating an argument, a lot of times an argument will be or a written piece will be a mix of actual argument and rhetoric. You need to ignore the rhetoric. You need to cut it out. All right, so anyway, that's what I wanted to say about what arguments are, and contrasting them with non-rational persuasion. Now I want to move on to saying a little bit about evaluating arguments, or actually maybe more than a little bit. So let's move on to that in the next lecture.